Hello, welcome to our worship facility webinar, Worship Elements, Good Rehearsals, Sound Checks, and Set Designs that Lead to Good Outcomes. I'm Worship Facility Editor Gene Lance. With us today is Golden Preciado.
Thank you so much, Gene. Again, I am Golden Preciado, and I just quickly wanted to introduce myself before we launch off into our topic for today. I work for QSC as a trainer and House of Worship specialist. At the same time, I enjoy my work as a freelance front of house and broadcast and recording engineer in both the secular and House of Worship world. I really enjoy working with churches, training and equipping their sound people, and I'm currently the lead audio engineer at my church, Grace Fellowship in Costa Mesa, California. Okay, so I love mixing in venues of all sizes, but my foremost desire for use of my skills in audio is as an educator. And this is why I'm so honored to be teaching on our topic for today, rehearsals, sound checks, and set designs that lead to a good outcome. Before I dive into the nitty-gritty, I want to define what is a good outcome. Well, in the secular music industry, the end result for a good outcome would be a performance with no mistakes on both the musician's end and on the technical end. The audience was thoroughly entertained and the event made a profit. In House of Worship, however, the end result for a good outcome is a little different. Ultimately, a good outcome here would be that individuals are able to experience God and be drawn into a closer relationship with Him. During a worship service, some of the things that help facilitate that in today's culture are the worship team playing with musical excellence and the tech side of things running smoothly and without noticeable mistakes. Creating an atmosphere where others can worship without distraction is super important. Because let's face it, there is nothing more distracting when, say, feedback occurs or there's a blaring musical mistake that causes every head to look up and see where the mistake came from. Or how about a muted microphone and every head turns to look at the sound person? It's important that church leadership and church tech people keep in perspective the ultimate outcome in a house of worship because it will help us to avoid some key challenges. The most common challenges I see as I'm working with churches are when church leadership asks for applications that overextend their available technical resources, and two, when church techs are asked to implement technical applications that are beyond their knowledge and understanding. So looking at number one, applications that overextend available technical resources. So my husband and I were visiting and leading worship in a small church. And we led worship with 2 guitars and 2 vocals, and it was a blessed time. And the pastor asked us in all his excitement if we might come back with a full worship band next time. Drums, bass, keys, electric guitar, and of course our 2 acoustic guitars and vocals. Well, this church had 1 loudspeaker attached to an A-frame for their mains in the ceiling, and the service was being run on a small analog mixer with only 2 aux ends, one of which was being used to feed their live stream. This is an example of overextending available technical resources. This church didn't have the gear available to accommodate what he was asking for. Now, looking at the second challenge, when church techs are asked to implement technical applications that are beyond their knowledge and understanding. So going back to the church that my husband and I had visited, let's say that a suitable mixer and floor wedges were purchased to support the full band application. Well, the volunteer who had been operating the sound there for years had never used anything beyond that small analog mixer. He knew where the mute buttons were and he knew how to push faders, but he hadn't learned how to run sound for a full worship band on a larger format console. And this would be an example of church techs being asked to implement technical applications that are beyond their knowledge and understanding. Examples of these 2 challenges can take many forms. Perhaps your church leadership is asking for a video wall or say a live stream that looks and sounds super professional like some other churches live stream. Or maybe they're asking that the worship band switch over to using in-ear monitors. Whatever the case may be, here is a checklist of questions that church leadership and AV techs should be honestly asking together when desiring to upgrade or make technical changes. Do we have the knowledge to make this happen? And do we have the available gear resources to make this happen? If you answered either no or I don't know to these first two questions, then you'll want to consider the next question. Are we willing to hire an experienced AV expert or integrator to install and or train? And finally, the question that makes the world go round, do we have the financial resources? And I know some of you are looking at these questions and thinking, well, these are just common sense questions, but you'd be surprised at how often one or more of these questions are not considered when a church upgrades or makes significant technical changes to their AV system. Okay, so here is a common story that happens when any one of these four questions are not considered. Church leadership says, we want to do this thing. Church leadership has no idea what it really takes to make this thing happen. The tech person has enough knowledge to be dangerous, but has no experience at doing this certain thing. And he says, either out of a sense of pride or perhaps duty, I think I can make this happen. And he may be trying as well to save the church money. So he skips the part about consulting with an experienced AV expert. Instead, he gets online and posts his question in an AV church group. How do I do this thing? He gets 200 replies of various ways to do this thing, every one of them different. The church tech is muddling through the comments, trying to figure out which comment might have the right advice. He finally makes a decision and ends up spending a large amount of the church's financial resources to buy this gear. Well, the gear arrives, and as the church tech is installing it, he gets stuck and can't quite figure out how to make it all work. In the end, the church needs to hire an AV expert to come in and fix it. The AV expert informs them that a few pieces of what they had purchased was the wrong gear for their application. And now the church has to backtrack and purchase the right gear. The AV expert is now being paid to uninstall what was done and reinstall the right gear the right way. And in the end, the church ends up spending 40% more than they could have to get the job done. Now let's say church leadership and the tech person had this checklist of questions in front of them, and they took an honest inventory of them. They would have probably consulted with an AV expert first, and the AV expert would have put together a design and have bought them exactly what they needed. It would have been installed the right way the first time and saved everyone a lot of heartache and money. I grew up in the music industry, as this was my dad's line of work. He was a professor of recording engineering and live sound reinforcement at Golden West College in Huntington Beach, California, as well as running his own recording studio and live sound and video business. And guess what? I was his little worker bee growing up. Actually, I was more like free help, but either way, I've learned so much of what I know by osmosis just working with my dad. One of the most valuable lessons that my dad taught me growing up was that it's okay to say, I don't know. I just don't know how to do that. Because how will we ever be in a position to learn if we can't admit that we might not know how to do something? Which brings me to the next valuable thing my dad taught me. Always be learning. Always be learning. As technology changes, I need to be educating myself. I need to be reading and studying and taking courses on specific technical subject matter that I need to learn, whether that be online or in person. Find a mentor. For the longest time, my dad was my mentor. Now I have a mentor at my work at QSC, someone who knows more than I do and has many more years experience than I do. For others, that mentor may be a reputable teacher online. We live in a world that is rapidly advancing technically. I feel like there's an awful lot of pressure for churches to have the latest and greatest technology implemented in their services. But the truth of the matter is, out of the 98% of churches that are 500 people or less, with about 90% of those being 150 or less, not every church will have the personnel or volunteers or financial resources to implement the latest and greatest tech. Whether a church has hired AV techs or they have volunteer tech operators, it's super important that a church's tech growth coincides with the technical knowledge and understanding of their tech operators and volunteers. If untrained operators are put in a position where they are in over their heads, the outcome will not be good, and it only causes frustration between the worship band and the tech operator. So with all that said, let's jump into some best practices on the technical side of things. So I chose a few hot topics that seem to be regular challenges in the house of worship world. First, let's talk about best practices for dealing with room acoustics and house speaker placement. When a church is having problems with clarity and intelligibility, oftentimes the first thing they think is, we need a new mixer or we need new speakers to fix this problem. But before we go spending a bunch of money on new gear, let's look at speaker placement and acoustics in our room. The sound that comes out of the speakers is called direct sound. Direct sound is what we, the listeners, want to be hearing for the best clarity and intelligibility. The main loudspeakers should be placed so that they are pointing at the heads of the people. This way, they are hearing as much direct sound as possible. I've seen so many churches where the main loudspeakers are placed high on the wall, pointing straight towards another wall, or pointing at the ceiling, or high in the ceiling, pointing at the back wall. This creates what is called reflected sound, as the sound from the loudspeaker is bouncing off the walls or the ceiling and then back at the listener. It's this reflected sound that is lacking in distinction and clarity. Churches that struggle the most with intelligibility are those with hard surfaces everywhere, like hard surfaced walls or hard surfaced floors or hard surfaced ceilings. Even if the main loudspeakers are properly placed, if the reflected sound is louder than the direct sound from the main speakers, this really causes a lack of intelligibility for the listener. Now, in a church with an installed sound system, adding acoustic treatment to these hard surfaces to absorb reflected sound will help greatly in restoring clarity and distinction. Laying carpet on the hard floors makes a big difference as well. Here in California, we have a ton of mobile churches that meet in school gymnasiums, auditoriums, and even in places like senior centers, all with hard surfaces. In meeting spaces where making changes to the space is not an option, using what is called distributed sound is a good method for creating as much direct sound as possible. When using distributed sound, additional loudspeakers are placed part of the way back. They're often referred to as delay speakers because a time delay will need to be added to these back speakers so that the sound from the front main loudspeakers arrives to the listeners sitting behind the delay speakers at the same time. Using distributed sound like this allows for more volume control of the speakers, which means there is less reflected sound off the hard surfaces. We have an installed system at my church, and we also have a pretty diverse range of people that attend our church. Running our services at a loud volume from the main loudspeakers would be distracting and frustrating for our congregation overall. So we use distributed sound. We have several delay speakers mounted to the ceilings in strategic places in our sanctuary, providing even dispersion of direct sound throughout the space and allowing us overall volume control of the surface. Distributed sound in an installed space is also super helpful in providing even coverage to places where the direct sound from the main speakers might not be reaching, as we see in this diagram, where we have speakers pointing at the balcony, as well as speakers providing sound for the seating under the balcony. Also notice the front fills providing direct sound to the first few rows where the coverage from the main speakers weren't quite reaching. Okay, hot topic number 2. Let's talk about best practices for using loudspeakers as floor monitors. And I'm going to focus on using monitors in small to medium spaces because there are many more challenges here than using monitors in a large space or outdoors. Monitors allow the musicians to reference themselves in relation to the other band members as they play together. So dialing in monitors is absolutely critical to the performance of each musician and the band as a whole. Poor monitoring can affect the band adversely and ultimately be a distraction to the worship time. For example, if singers can't hear themselves, they may sing with poor pitch. If the drummer can't hear enough of the rhythm guitar or bass guitar, they may not be playing in good time together, and the list goes on. The important thing to note about dialing in monitors is that every musician will have their own preferences to help them achieve their best performance. The problem with floor monitors is that they create additional sound on the stage, and this can be a problem in smaller spaces when the stage volume and reflected energy off the stage back and side walls is louder than the house loudspeakers. When this happens, the audience will hear a lot of volume, but with very little clarity and intelligibility. A common misconception is that having fewer loudspeakers on stage will minimize the stage volume, but this just isn't the case. When multiple musicians are referring to the same floor monitor, no one is receiving exactly what they need for a solid performance. So each musician will ask to have themselves turned up in the monitor, which skews the mix for the other musician sharing it. Each musician will continue to request more of what they need in the single monitor that they all share until the monitor volume becomes uncomfortably loud with no reference or clarity for any of the musicians. So, rule of thumb, whenever possible, each musician should have their own floor monitor with their own monitor mix. This way, each musician can reference only what they need in their monitor, which will significantly lower the overall stage volume. When mixing monitors in large spaces or outdoors, it's perfectly acceptable to set all the monitor mixes before bringing up the house. But in smaller spaces, we'll need to go about things just a little differently, or the sound pressure level will get out of control by the time you bring up the house mix. The first thing I like to do is hear what volume is naturally coming off the stage with no monitors or no house volume. I'm listening for the balance between the acoustic drums, bass and guitar amps, and any other amps on stage. A lot can be fixed right here by having your musicians adjust their amp volumes so that there is balance. Now, I realize that getting your musicians to cooperate with this can sometimes be a challenge, and that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother conversation. But once I've established the balance between drums and amps, then I'll add only nominal monitor volume, just enough so that the musicians can give me a song. I will then dial in the house mix at the approximate volume I will run for the service. Then I will go back to the stage and finish dialing in the musicians' monitors. Now, because we are in a smaller space, the musicians are already hearing quite a bit from the house speakers and the amps around them. So now, as I'm working with the musicians' monitors, they're mostly requesting things that are just filling in the blanks with any additional reference they might need. Now, it's important to note, after all is said and done, the house speakers will need to be louder than the stage volume in order to maintain any kind of clarity for the audience. In some cases, the audience may not be so tolerant of listening at this volume level. Church leadership may ask the sound person to turn down the house volume. You'll notice, however, that when the stage volume exceeds the volume from the house speakers, the sound from the audience perspective becomes muddy and indistinct. At this point, you're dealing with the laws of physics, and one cannot change the laws of physics. So, is there a solution? Well, yes, there is a solution, and this brings me to our next hot topic. Let's talk about best practices for using in-ear monitors. So I'm a musician and singer, as well as an audio engineer, so I can speak with absolute understanding from both points of view. In-ear monitors create an almost silent stage, allowing the front of house engineer ultimate control of the house mix. The engineer is no longer dealing with muddy sound being thrown off the stage from loud floor monitors, and they can contour a beautiful sounding present mix without overwhelming the room with excessive volume. In a space with hard surfaces, using in-ear monitors will solve about 70% of issues with intelligibility during worship time. However, for musicians who have never used in-ear monitors, this can be a daunting process. And believe me, I totally get it. Learning how to properly use in-ear monitors takes, number one, education, and number two, it takes some practice. For this reason, I would have several practices with in-ear monitors before ever using them during a worship service. I also would make sure that each musician has been trained on how to properly use and set their in-ear mixes. All right, so let's dive in. The absolute best and most natural way to use in-ear monitors is to listen in stereo. Why? Because our ears naturally hear in stereo. So let's take a quick look at how we'll be setting up our mixing console. We'll be creating a stereo pair using 2 aux outputs per musician, or buses as they're often referred to on some consoles. The output channels should be linked together to create the stereo pair. On my mixer, this is indicated by the chain link icon. The aux outputs that you see on the left turn into one larger box when the channels are linked. If your church has chosen to use personal monitor mixers, they'll already be set up in stereo. When dialing in a mix for your stereo in-ear monitors, instruments should be panned across the stereo field. Panning helps create delineation between instruments, allowing the musician to easily reference what they need. Here is a graphic representation of what panning might look like in a musician's in-ear mix. In general, instruments that will most always want to be mixed up the center would be your kick drum, your snare, and bass. Other instruments that will most likely be mixed up the center will be the instrument that you're playing, or if you're singing, your vocal mic. Other instruments can be panned at varying degrees to the left and right to create a full and wide mix in your ears. Inputs that can be panned hard left right would be your drum overhead mics and keyboards. One of the biggest complaints from musicians trying out in-ear monitors is that they feel disconnected from the audience. Most earbuds create a seal in the ear, cutting out a great deal of ambience that the worship team is so accustomed to. But here is a solution. In the upper left and right corners of the graph, you'll see audience left and right mics. These are microphones, usually condenser mics, that have been set up on the left and right side of the stage facing towards the audience. These can be panned hard left, right. The musicians can add these audience mics to their in-ear mix at whatever volume they might need to feel and hear the presence of the congregation. When set up and dialed in properly, stereo in-ear monitors can be one of the most enjoyable and inspirational experiences your worship team will ever have. I believe one of the reasons so many musicians don't like in-ear monitors is because they were first exposed to a mono in-ear mix. That is a mix coming from one channel instead of two. And here's what happens in a mono in-ear mix. Everything becomes one big wall of sound mixed up the center with little distinction between instruments. We weren't created to process audio in this manner, which makes mono in-ear monitoring difficult to get used to. However, some churches may not have enough outputs on their console to provide the entire worship team with stereo in-ear mixes, or perhaps not enough resources to purchase personal monitor mixers. In these cases, though it's not optimal, the worship team may need to learn to work with a mono mix. And again, this will take some practice and getting used to. When referencing a mono in-ear mix, it's best to add only what you absolutely need in order to play well. You don't get to mix a record in your ears when you're working with a mono mix. Here's a graphic representation of what working with a mono mix might look like. The faded instruments represent those with less volume. The musician referencing this mix is probably a guitar player and vocalist. Their guitar and vocal are the most forward in the mix. The other vocals are set somewhat under his own, but there's enough so that he can hear their harmonies. The only drum mics he needed were the kick and the hi-hat, and notice that they are set pretty far back in his mix. Adding all the other drum mics added too much extra noise that was not contributing to his reference. He has a small amount of the other instruments in there with just enough audience mic level that he can hear what's going on in the service. As a musician myself, I noticed that when I've had to work with in-ear mixes that are mono, that adding too much volume from condenser mics like drum overheads, hi-hat mic, and audience mics tends to take away from the clarity of my in-ear mix. For that reason, I will use condenser mics sparingly in my in-ear mono mix. A common practice among many musicians using in-ear monitors, especially those referencing a mono mix, is to leave one earbud in and the other out. And they do this so that they can hear the ambient noise around them. But folks, this is an unhealthy practice and contributes to hearing loss over time. Musicians who do this will tend to run their volume in that one ear 6 to 10 dB hotter than if both earbuds were being used. And if you're one of these people, to give yourself an idea of just how loud your earbud volume is, stick the other ear back in for a minute while the band is playing. This will be a good reality check. And there have been many studies done on this topic, and I would encourage you to check them out. Okay, next topic. Let's talk about training new volunteer musicians and/or singers who are joining the worship team. The vast majority of churches are implementing volunteers from their congregation to be part of their worship team. Some may be seasoned musicians who want to help out, and others may be less experienced. Either way, training the musicians on best practices using the gear on stage and any protocols that are related to setup will save a lot of time and heartache in the end. If you can't train them in person, making detailed training videos, even with just an iPhone camera, is a great option. For example, here are some topics you might include in your worship team training. Train vocalists how to properly sing into a microphone, keeping close proximity to the mic. If there are floor monitors involved, teach them why you don't point the microphone towards the monitor. This includes dropping your arm by your side with a microphone in your hand. Train your acoustic guitar players how to properly plug into a direct box. Show them the way the signal flows. You can train your electric guitar players on your protocol for using electric guitar amps. If your protocol is to keep loud amps backstage or to baffle them up, train them on what you want before they ever go live on stage. If your worship team is using in-ear monitors, absolutely train each player on how to use them and how to properly dial them in. Whether your musicians are using tablets to dial in their mixes or personal monitor mixers, make sure they've been given a thorough training on how to use the tech, and then have them practice with the band a few times before doing anything live. The concepts that I've taught in today's training on in-ear monitors are things that should be taught before any musician goes live on stage. Let's say you're a mobile church and setting up and tearing down every Sunday. You may have a protocol that each player set up and tear down their own position. You might train them how to properly roll a cable, maybe collapse their mic stand and where to store it. The more you can train your worship musicians on how to use the gear on stage and any other protocols that you might want them to follow, the more smoothly your Sunday morning sound checks will go. When your worship team members know exactly what's expected of them in all aspects of their service in the worship ministry, before they serve, like attitudes, use of stage tech, and your protocols, the whole worship team will be walking into a much more relaxed environment, and the focus can now move away from the technical to worshiping God. And this is a good outcome. Now, really quick, I'd like to talk about one more super important topic: volunteer sound people in the house of worship. And to start off, I want to tell you a little story. Now, the names in this story are not real people, but the situation is ever so real. So Angela was so excited when Pastor Tony mentioned from the stage that they were in need of AV volunteers. You don't need to know anything about audio or video. We'll show you which buttons to push and which knobs to turn, stated Pastor Tony. We just need some willing hearts ready to serve. Well, these words sparked a stirring in Angela's heart. She loved to serve wherever she could. She had only been a part of her church for about 3 months and desired to become more integrated in her church community. Perhaps, she thought, serving in AV would allow me to be of more help to my church and develop some lasting friendships at the same time. So, continued Pastor Tony, if you would like to serve in AV, please give me a show of hands. Knowing what she had to do, she joyfully raised her hand, and thus began one of the most adventurous and difficult journeys of service in the church that she had ever embarked on. She reported to the sound booth early the next Sunday. Another volunteer quickly started showing her the ropes. Push this button at this time, push this fader up if you need more of that. Oh, and don't forget to record the pastor's message by pushing this button here. Angela frantically took notes as the volunteer continued showing her around. She was a capable woman with a great memory, and she would do exactly what she had been instructed to do and fulfill her place of service. When the volunteer was done explaining things, he left. Angela found herself alone and becoming anxious as she stared down at the mixing console, replete with a plethora of colorful buttons, knobs, and dials, and faders staring back at her as if to say, yeah, you just try me out and see what happens. Still, Angela was determined to be of service. So as the pastor walked up onto the stage, she dutifully brought up the fader marked "Pastor's Love." As she did this, the sound system started wailing into multiple frequencies of feedback. She was startled and terrified. She wasn't expecting this. So she quickly turned down the fader all the way down, and the pastor made a quick joke about it from the stage and continued with the Sunday morning greeting. She again started to bring up the fader, but this time very slowly and cautiously. The result was the same as the feedback monster started to rear its ugly head again. Angela was so discouraged. She wanted so badly to be of service, but instead her active service at the soundboard turned into an utter distraction to the pastor and the entire congregation. Now, I imagine there are a number of you ministry leaders and volunteers painfully identifying with the story right now. The fact of the matter is, most churches will utilize volunteers within their congregation to some capacity for their audio and visual needs. Serving as a volunteer can be one of the most fulfilling experiences. But for those who volunteer for AV, oftentimes they have no idea what they're getting into. And a lack of support and training will lead to frustration, discouragement, and eventually burnout. So I grew up in church. I've been an AV volunteer. I have been a hired front of house and broadcast engineer. And I have been an AV director, and I'm currently the AV director at my home church, Grace Fellowship in Costa Mesa, California. In all my years of running church sound, I've learned that getting people to volunteer is only the beginning. The hard part is keeping your volunteers. In my experience, keeping your AV volunteers boils down to 3 intentional practices. Number 1, leadership. Number 2, training and education for your volunteers. And 3, cultivating relationships. So let's start with leadership and the role of the AV leader. First off, no matter what size church you are, it's super helpful to establish an AV leader or overseer who has ample technical knowledge. This person may be employed by the church. They might be a volunteer who's knowledgeable about AV, or it might even be a contracted person from outside the church. With that said, the AV leader should have the following main roles. First would be to maintain the systems, and that doesn't mean they have to repair everything by themselves. What it means is that they need to be able to identify a problem or broken piece of equipment so that they can either purchase the right replacement part or hire the right person and or integrator for the solution. The AV leader will be the person to establish a unified technical protocol for volunteers to follow so that volunteers know exactly what's expected of them. And more on that in a second. It's helpful also if the AV leader is the one to schedule the volunteers, since they will know best the technical capabilities of the volunteers. And with that said, here are a few helpful protocols that can be implemented to help create a productive and smooth experience for the volunteer tech and ultimately the church as well. Your volunteers must be trained on how to use the equipment they're operating, whether that's setting up the stage, operating the mixer, or running the media and video. Now, training can take place as a specific event, but more realistically, it's done while on the job during sound check and during the service. Consider making detailed how-to videos specifically related to your church's setup and operations. And this will prep a new volunteer before they ever touch the equipment. And next, never leave new and or unexperienced volunteers alone to run sound. Though a volunteer may know what buttons to push at a certain time, if they haven't yet learned the art of troubleshooting when a problem arises, that volunteer will not know how to fix it. And it can be very disheartening, a disheartening experience for them when this happens. It leads to frustration for everyone. As your more experienced volunteers gain skills, pair them up with less experienced volunteers. This not only allows the new volunteer to learn new skills, but reinforces those skills in the one that's teaching them. And next, because most unexperienced volunteers will generally not understand all the routing and signal flow in a system, following a unified and systematic technical protocol is essential. So what does that even look like? Well, this will vary from church to church, depending on the size and capabilities of the volunteers. But the average church of maybe 200 people or less, it might look like this. On stage, each instrument might have pre-assigned channels on the stage box or floor pockets to plug into. Label those inputs clearly so that the volunteer knows exactly where that instrument should be plugged into. And you can leave a few blank channels for instruments that might not be part of the normal worship setup. All monitor wedges and in-ear outputs might have a unified position on stage and labeled at the stage box or floor pockets. Next, back to the mixing console. It's super helpful if every volunteer is working from a unified scene or session. The input channels on the scene should line up with the input channels on the stage, one-to-one. Here's a word to the wise. Just because you can do a hard patch or a soft patch doesn't mean it's a good idea. This is very confusing to a volunteer. They will come in to do their job, find that something doesn't work, and will have no idea what happened to it or what to do to fix it. So when you're working with volunteers, just keep everything one-to-one. I remember assessing a sound system at a church because the audio volunteer told me that out of 24 channels, only 3 were still working. As I traced each signal path, I discovered that every channel was indeed working fine, but the channels had been repatched so many times that they had simply lost track of the signal flow. Okay, next, Consider creating and saving instrument channel presets on your mixer. It's helpful to have an experienced engineer dial in starting points, for example, preamp gains, EQs, dynamics, and effects for the specific instruments that are being used on a regular basis. Save those presets to your mixer's library and teach the volunteer how to pull in those instrument presets for that specific instrument or vocal, and show them how to adjust the preamp gain as needed. Okay, so here are a few tips to maintain the stability of your sound system. After an experienced engineer has dialed in your system, consider restricting access to certain things like amplifiers and digital signal processing gear. On hardware pieces, you might use grill plates to do this. Once your routing is set up on your mixer, it's also a good idea to add restrictions on this as well. Well, when all is said and done, a perfect operating protocol for your tech volunteers doesn't guarantee perfection, and it certainly doesn't guarantee that everything will run smoothly all the time. But having a framework to work within and guidelines to follow will help everyone know better exactly what's expected of them. Okay, so next, intentional practice for working with volunteers, training and education. When it comes to AV volunteers, just knowing which button or fader to push at what time or where something regularly gets plugged into will not be enough to solve problems as they arise. And rest assured, technical issues will pop up from time to time. For this reason, I highly recommend that church sound volunteers invest in expanding their audio knowledge through some kind of continuing education. And no, you don't have to go back to school. These days, this is easily done as there are so many wonderful online courses available, many with specific house of worship application. And I'll give you a couple of resources at the end of this session. So why invest in audio training and continuing education? Simple. Training breeds knowledge. Knowledge brings understanding. And understanding delivers confidence to the volunteer and empowers them to skillfully serve in their area of ministry. And who knows? One of your volunteers may very well be your next AV leader. Okay, so the third intentional practice, and I believe this one will set the precedence for keeping your volunteers, and that is cultivating relationships. Volunteers are more than just operational help. They are people with feelings who are freely giving their time for God's service. Volunteers will often get involved in church service to become more integrated into their church body. Those who volunteer in AV are most likely not trying to make a career out of audio engineering. They just want to be part of a greater whole. And with this said, how ministry leaders and AV directors treat their volunteers are by far the largest contributing factor to whether a volunteer stays or leaves. Now, in my story about Angela, she was utterly discouraged from her disastrous first day of running sound, and she was ready to quit. At the end of service, the assistant pastor sat next to her and extended her grace and encouragement. He assured her that her heart to serve was precious above all, and that with more training, she would play a vital role in her church's AV ministry. Unfortunately, I have seen all too often where something goes wrong and the ministry staff or AV director becomes frustrated and angry with the volunteers. And I've heard some altogether discouraging comments that lead to them giving up and quitting because they were so hurt. Volunteers and church workers need to feel appreciated and encouraged by their church leadership. Every job performed in a church fellowship, whether it's cleaning toilets, working in the children's ministry, running sound, or even being the senior pastor, is just as important as the next job. And we are serving the greater body of Christ and ultimately our Father God. So I could give you a list of how-tos. on this, but instead, I want to tell you about our senior teaching pastor, Dave, from my church. He often makes it a point to thank me for my work and tells me how much he appreciates what I do. He always extends a warm and hearty greeting when he sees me. He often asks me this question: how can I make your job easier? And there's been times when I've been shorthanded, and Dave will jump in there and help me with setup and tear down, carrying heavy equipment, rolling cables. These simple acts of kindness and servant leadership make me feel appreciated. So in wrapping up this section, if you have AV volunteers, remember these 3 intentional practices: provide clear leadership, offer and encourage training and education, and most importantly, cultivate relationships with your volunteers. Before I go, I wanted to leave you with a few words of encouragement. In our technical world that we live in today, it's so important that we always be learning and growing in our craft. Whether you're a musician or a sound person or both, never stop learning. And to that end, I want to leave you with a couple of valuable audio training resources. The first is QSC's House of Worship audio training course. This is a free AVIXA accredited training that every church sound volunteer and ministry leader will benefit from. In this comprehensive modular online training course, you'll learn the basics of audio engineering, from properly rolling a cable and setting up a PA system to building monitor mixes and running sound for your service. If you have a brand new, unexperienced volunteer who wants to help out with audio, you might consider having them complete this course before they ever put fingers on faders. So for this, you can go to qsc.com and click on training. Again, that's qsc.com and click on training. The next resource is the Church Sound Training Facebook group. This is a group I started during the pandemic. Whether you're a church sound volunteer or a seasoned sound person, the learning never ends. No matter where you are in your journey, this group is a valuable resource as you'll learn universal audio concepts that you can apply across the board. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure sharing with you all. And I just want to leave you with a scripture that I hold near and dear to my heart from 1 Corinthians 10:13. In whatever you do all to the glory of God. I'm Golden Preciado, and thank you so much for listening, and may God richly bless you.
Thank you very much, Golden. That was some great information. And thank you for attending today. If you have any questions, please email them to me at glast@worshipfacility.com, and we'll get you some answers. Thank you again. I hope you enjoy this webinar.